What if science and spirituality aren't actually opposed to each other? What if they're sometimes describing overlapping territories, but using different language? Whenever I thought or talked about the observer, the part of you that can watch a thought instead of being swept away by it, I couldn't help but wonder whether there's any research on that topic. I figured that if I'm tapped into this idea that we, with some practice, can watch our thoughts, then I know others are too. So maybe somebody out there has designed a study to better understand the process. And it turns out that that answer is a big one. In fact, too big for a quick response. So that's where the idea for this series started. But I want to clear up a misunderstanding first. And you should know there was a time when I believed this myself. Many of us have been taught, or perhaps we just assume, that science and spirituality are on opposite teams. But really, it's more like they're on opposite ends of a spectrum. It's as if we've been taught that we have to pick one side and stick with it. You're either on the side of science or you're on team woohoo spiritual. No mixing. You're the type that meditates and talks about awareness, or you're the person who wants a controlled study accompanied by peer-reviewed evidence. But that split isn't as real as it may appear. In fact, some of the most rigorous neuroscience of the last 20th century has explored questions like what happens in the brain when you stop identifying with a thought, and what changes when somebody practices meditation over time. The scientists asking those questions aren't necessarily proving or disproving what we've discussed in previous episodes, but in many cases, they are exploring related territory from a very different angle. Let me give you a taste of it without drowning you in technical jargon. You see, your brain has a network of connected regions that scientists call the default mode network. We've talked about that in the last episode. Its activity often increases when you're resting, or when your attention turns inward instead of remaining focused on an outside task, like when you're in the shower, when you're stuck in traffic, or laying awake staring at the ceiling at 1 a.m. That's when the network may become most active. But it doesn't simply switch on and off. Its activity rises and falls depending on what you're doing or where your attention is directed. The default mode network is involved in several different processes: remembering the past, imagining the future, thinking about yourself, and considering the thoughts and feelings of other people. It also strongly associated with what researchers call self-referential processing. That's the thinking organized around us: our experiences, our relationships, our choices, and ongoing stories we tell ourselves about who we are. Here's the finding that stopped me in my tracks the first time I read it. In studies of experienced long-term meditators, researchers have found lower activity in the part of the default mode network under certain conditions, along with differences in how parts of that network communicate with other regions. The network doesn't disappear, and it doesn't permanently shut off. Its activity changes in a way that appears to be connected to long-term meditation practices. Interestingly enough, researchers did not find that same clear pattern in people who were brand new to meditation. That suggests that this may not be an instant change. It's not something that happens the first time you sit down and meditate. It appears to be something that develops with sustained practice. Also, and this is a separate study, researchers have studied something they called decentering. Decentering is the ability to notice a thought without becoming completely caught up in it. And researchers have described three important parts of that skill: noticing your own mental process, not identifying completely with what you've noticed, and becoming less reactive to it. Now, if you've been watching my previous episodes, tell me they don't sound familiar. In fact, that sounds a lot like the observer, who observes the thought while not getting caught up in it. For example, the thought, "I'm not good enough," is only true if you believe it's true. When you are caught up in that thought, it doesn't feel like it's just a thought, it feels like the truth. And your emotions, your body, and your choices may begin responding as if that's proof that you're not good enough. Decentering teaches us to create a little space. Instead of, I'm not good enough, it becomes, I'm noticing that I'm having a thought that I'm not good enough. The thought hasn't disappeared, and you haven't replaced it with positive thinking, but you have started watching the thought instead of automatically obeying it. That huge shift is where choice begins. And that is the practical value of realizing that you are the observer, not the thought. And I want to be precise here. Decentering is a psychological skill researchers can define and study. The observer, as I understand and experience it, has a spiritual and mystical dimension. For me, the observer is more than the ability to step back from a thought. It's the experience of discovering that beneath all of that thinking, there's an awareness that can witness it. Thoughts come and go, emotions rise and fall. The story I'm telling myself may change completely, yet something within me is aware that all of this is happening. And yes, science can study the mental shifts that allow us to step back from a thought, but it cannot yet tell us what that awareness ultimately is. And that's where the mystery remains. Science has not proven that they're the same thing, but they're certainly describing overlapping parts of the human experience, yet from very different perspectives. One uses the language of a laboratory, the other uses the language of a mystic. But here's what I want you to take from this episode. Before we go any further into the science, the observer was never a metaphor I made up to make suffering sound prettier. It describes something I discovered in my own life. What fascinated me wasn't that science had proven what I had experienced, it hadn't. It was that research using brain imaging, behavioral studies, and psychological assessments were describing something that sounded remarkably familiar. They gave me another way to understand something I had already experienced myself. And the good news is that you don't need a laboratory to explore this for yourself. So here's something you can try when you're ready. At some point, when your mind is doing its normal wandering, replaying something, rehearsing something, or worrying about something, pause for 10 seconds and ask yourself one question. Who's noticing this? You don't have to answer it. You don't have to fix anything. Just notice that the noticing is happening. That's the whole exercise. In miniature, it resembles part of the mental shifts researchers have been trying to understand and measure. And why would they bother if this wasn't common experience from any of us? So, is there science behind the observer? Well, there certainly is science behind the ability to step back from our thoughts, recognizing it's a mental event and becoming less reactive to it. Researchers call that decentering. And there's evidence that sustained meditation is associated with changes in brain activity and connectivity. Does that prove the spiritual observer exists? No. Science hasn't answered that question yet. But it does tell us that our ability to watch our thoughts instead of automatically being controlled by them is real. The observer isn't something we have to create, it's a natural part of being human. Heck, I believe that the observer is who we actually are, consciousness. And most of us were simply never taught to recognize it. But with practice, we can learn to live from it. What that awareness ultimately is remains open to interpretations. And perhaps that question is where science and mysticism finally meet. I would like to take a moment to thank you for supporting my work, liking this video, and subscribing to the channel. In fact, each subscription inspires me to make more. Hi, I'm Dr. James. I'll see you in the next episode, because growth doesn't end here, and there's so much more to unpack together. So when you're ready, your next step is waiting.